mainstream media gives essentially the same message because why?
Well, we have to look what the message is. First of all, the message is one of remarkable subordination to power. Now, power in the United States doesn't happen to be in the state. It's not a centralized military bureaucratic state like in the Soviet Union.
Right.
Power in the United States primarily lies in corporations, in the corporate world. There's very narrow concentration of control over resources, over investment decisions, and so on and so forth. And that affects everything. You can't help affecting everything. It affects the government because this means that there's a very close link between governmental power and corporate power. Furthermore, just the ability to make investment decisions and financial decisions places bounds on what any government could do.
Yes.
Furthermore, now let's go to the major media. What are the major media? Well, they're huge corporations. Okay, the New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, they first of all are large corporations, quite profitable ones, in fact. Secondly, they're parts of even bigger conglomerates, like, Westinghouse and GE and so on. Now, like any corporation, they sell a product on a market. This is a market, roughly a kind of a state-guided market society. What's the product and what's the market? Well, the market's advertisers. That is other businesses. So they're selling a product to other businesses. Corporations are selling a product to other businesses. What's the product? Well, the product is audiences. Now, for the major media, the ones that kind of set the agenda, they're selling elite audiences, privileged audiences. The New York Times, say, is targeting privileged elite sectors of the population. That's their audience, and they're trying to sell that audience to other businesses. Now, so we have to begin with, just on the most elementary grounds, we look at a system. Suppose we're Martians. We're looking at this system. We say, okay, here are huge corporations selling privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what picture of the world do you expect to come out of that? Then we begin to add other factors. If let's say you're the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, or a pundit on the op-ed page, and you want to really have important, insights into the government. Well, we all know how that's done. You have lunch with the Secretary of State. He tells you the lies that he wants to appear tomorrow. You write them and you say, a high source in Washington, my intrepid reporting has discovered that a high source in Washington said so-and-so. In fact, if you compare the internal declassified record, of, say, people like Dean Acheson's decisions, and you look at, say, James Reston's columns, they're pretty close. And the same will be true about James Baker and Thomas Friedman. And furthermore, this is an open secret. We know that this is the way. It's not a big secret in the journalistic profession that this is. Now, in order to maintain those contacts, you better present the world a certain way, or those contacts are going to be cut off. You'll lose your opportunity to have to appear, to have special insight, to have leaks, to be able to come across with a story, a couple hours before the next person, and so on. Plus, now in order there's an interplay here which requires power in order to maintain your own power. That's another factor over and above the just structural and institutional properties.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Gretos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Our guest today on the Radical Imagination is David Eisenbach, an expert on media and politics who follows in the rich tradition of critical thinkers and truth tellers like I.F. Stone, Marshall McLuhan, Noam Chomsky, and George Orwell. They all warned us of how the media can undermine our security and democracy. Izzy Stone was well known for digging into public records and back-page stories to track down and expose stories the mainstream corporate news simply did not sign on to. They ignored it. He famously said that we need to always keep in mind that governments lie. All governments lie. The communications theorist Marshall McLuhan coined the term "the medium is a message" in the mid-1960s. He believed the communication medium itself should be our primary focus because it shaped and controlled human thought and action much more than the message. Noam Chomsky has argued for decades that the mass media was a powerful ideological institution that carried out a propaganda model of communication to sustain and perpetuate a system of greed and militarism. And George Orwell, in his 1984 world of the thought police and Big Brother, portrays one person struggling to hold on to what is real and valuable. Truth is the most fragile thing in the world. The central drama of politics is the one inside your skull. David Eisenbach is a historian who teaches courses on the United States presidency, media, and politics at Columbia University. He was a Democratic candidate in the 2017 primary election and 2019 special election for New York City's public advocate. His book, Gay Power, An American Revolution, traced how the gay rights movement in the 60s and 70s transformed American politics and society. In his second book, The Kingmakers, How the Media Threatens Our Security and Our Democracy, co-authored with Alaskan Senator Mike Gravel, they argue that the American media is the, quote unquote, the biggest threat to our democracy. Along with former Hustler magazine editor Larry Flint, he wrote One Nation Under Sex, which documents how the private lives of America's most powerful leaders have shaped our history. In the face of continuing coup attempts by neo-fascists to destroy America's democracy, David's truth-telling helps us understand the drama of politics playing out in many of our skulls and souls. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Jim. That was a beautiful introduction.
Well, we're going to play around with our souls and skulls, as Orwell put it. It's wonderful to have you on, and it really is an honor. And I'm really very interested in dialoguing with you and your work that you've been doing. To start it off, I noticed that you graduated from Columbia in 1994. So you missed, and you also you've taught courses on the culture of the 60s and history of the 60s in Manhattan School of Music. So you missed much of the turmoil. Well, you missed all of the turmoil of the 60s that I went through at Columbia. And yet you've remained true to some of the ideals and visions that were developed there. So maybe we can start by telling our audience how that came about.
Well, I, grew up as a Generation X son of two baby boomers, two people from the hippie generation.
Okay, there it goes. Okay.
So as a historian, that gave me the ability to kind of look at the achievements and the failures of the baby boomers, that 1960s generation, with a critical eye, and seeing what was successful, what was not successful. And I kind of brought that analysis to my first book about the gay rights movement, Gay Power.
What did your parents do? What do your parents do? What profession, career, occupation?
They're retired now. My mother was a school teacher. My father worked in real estate for Estee Lauder.
Okay, but they went through a hippie period in their youth.
Yeah, they did the typical kind of hippie thing. Hippie turns yuppie, the me generation move. So I kind of grew up sort of, like, as I said, with that sense of skepticism about that generation and what it did, but also an admiration for the idealism and enthusiasm and energy taking it to the streets that my generation did not have.
Interesting. And we won't get into much of the psychoanalysis of all this, but so your parents, in a sense, or certainly your father sounds like, going into real estate, and after his sojourn into left politics and left lifestyles. So did that give you a sort of, how did that ring true to your own upbringing? Was there conflicts in how you saw him in particular?
It was almost more like a sort of an understanding of the pushes that made that generation settle down, buy in, sell out, if you will, and seeing a greater story here. How a system, let's say the American system, can incorporate change, but still keep the basic kind of capitalistic system going. And so looking at that through baby boomers right up through the new changes that are happening, mainly generated by millennials and Generation Z, I can kind of see, wait a second, we're seeing a lot of change that sort of is more cosmetic than actually structural.
Right. Very great point. We're going to get into this more. But now, the gay rights movement really had a very strong foundation at Columbia. Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and so on, actually going back to the 40s. So how did you get involved in writing about that?
Well, I was really interested in that era, and there had been, really, you had the kind of first generation scholarship of the gay rights movement, mainly written by the activists themselves. And as a historian, I wanted to kind of bring that's what happens with the next critique that comes in, the next generation, the revision, let's say, to kind of place this movement within the bigger context of what's going on in the 1960s. So that was my objective in Gay Power, and I focused on the New York movement and its ties to Columbia University in one of the chapters about the Student Homophile League, which was the first gay student organization officially recognized by Columbia University in 1967. So we're kind of like looking at the beginnings of this movement, how it achieved so much so quickly, and how it precipitated a backlash, which would become a major plank in the Republican Party.
And you've already said this a few times. The revisionists, the reformists, in a sense, we're not talking necessarily about selling out, but the inevitability of a particular historical era to come to a close. But aren't there patterns and visions that you see operating today? Perhaps Poor People's Campaign, for example, with Reverend William Barber, or some of the environmental movements of young people today too. Doesn't that, or Black Lives Matter, for example, as well, doesn't that go back to the activism and vision of the 60s and not really selling out at this point?
Well, yeah. I mean, look, the story is yet to be told and finished with today's movement, but there's no question you have these time periods in American history when there is a kind of conservative kind of crouch. And I see that, in the post-World War II era, 1950s era, there was a similar move in the 1970s and 80s, right? The era of sort of my generation, where there was not much radical impact on the greater society coming out of Generation X. And what we're seeing here with the millennials is very similar with the baby boomers, where there is this major outcry for change and a move for change. How effective this is, as I said, is a story yet to be told. And there are some hopeful signs, but there are also some distressing signs in looking at what's going on today.
Now, you also did this terrific book with Senator Gravel, who was really one of the heroes of the 60s as well, and a fierce opponent of the Vietnam War. So what was that like? What was that experience like to go back again with this great politician and activist, writing a book with him about this period again?
Yeah, well, this emerged because I was working for Mike Gravel as his communications director. So this emerged out of conversations we had about basically unfair treatment in the media, how we were getting short shrift, he was not being taken seriously, He was being snubbed at the debates. And we began to kind of make those connections between the story of the campaign and its relationship with the media and a bigger problem of how the media is the kingmaker, right? They do pick sides. They do choose favored candidates. They do massage our democracy to the point where it's not the people who choose, but it's the media. And then making the further connections between how the George W. Bush administration was massaging the push towards war in the wake of 9/11 and the lead up to Iraq, and kind of making the bigger connections between domestic media influence and foreign policy.
Absolutely. One more question about your education at Columbia and the impact of the historian James Shenton on you. You said that he was profound, had a profound influence on your understanding of what the power of storytelling is all about. So tell us about that experience, how he influenced you.
Well, Jim was my mentor at Columbia, and he was a friend. And he kind of taught me that power of the story, that you can get so much more mileage in terms of communicating a message through a good story than you can by just lecturing somebody about a subject. And if you can like work your message into the story, you can communicate and educate so much more powerfully. And that's what I've been doing as a professor, every day. That's my real job. It's also what I do as a writer. It's what I do as a television host. So it's become part of my persona publicly, but also just my vocational duty as a teacher.
And I know we talked about this a little bit before you came on the show a couple of weeks ago, which of course very, very much intrigued me. As an academic and a scholar, doing work, serious academic work on elections and social movements and so on, you made a decision to enter into the political fray, and as I think you put it to me, really see what was going on. So you left the ivory tower, which we both respect very, very much, but you entered into the political fray, running for public advocate. So what was that experience like? How did that connect with your research and your studies? And was it that eye-opening an experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it was first as a New Yorker who was just so sick of watching the city that we love disappear, the empty storefronts, the crisis of the small business, the luxury towers that are taking over our neighborhoods, the mass displacement, mainly directed at people of color and immigrants, and having enough is enough. And I wasn't hearing anything from the politicians, who were all just going along with the Bill de Blasio approach to affordable housing. And I just wanted to stand up and say my piece. So I hit the kind of political world in New York at a moment in 2017 when there was no challenger to the then sitting public advocate Tish James. So it was a one-on-one matchup between Tish and I. And at the same time, the comptroller, Scott Stringer, he ran unchallenged. So it was a kind of a nadir in democracy. Now, after AOC got elected, you have many candidates jumping in, but it wasn't the kind of thing that a non-politician would do back in 2017, which seems such a long time ago. But I got to see why, how the system of politics really works. I'd been lecturing about it for years, writing about it, but to actually do it, that's how I now understand it.
What'd you learn?
I learned that now I know why they don't do the right thing. That it's not just a matter of being, a good guy or a bad guy in politics. That the name of the game is giving the appearance of being for the people. And by the way, this is both for Republicans and Democrats. Giving the appearance for the people when you're actually working the interests of the powerful and the money. And it's the talent to be able to maintain that appearance of populism, let's say, but to actually serve the interests of the moneyed and the powerful and the party bosses, and do what you're told, right? That's how you get ahead in politics. And the system is structured so that an independent voice, it's almost impossible to actually make a difference. And as soon as you do, they're going to come after you to make sure that you join the club and you play ball.
Right. Or destroy your chances as they did with Bernie Sanders, for example.
That's right.
Even having gravel get on.
And you, by sticking your head out, will get no protection from the media. The media will never come to your rescue, will never point out how you were destroyed. They will look the other way because they're taking the money from the same interests. So as long as you kind of understand that going in, right, the system is rigged. It's just like, we already knew what I kind of knew in my heart, but I needed to see it in person. I'm telling you, the system is rigged.
So where does it leave us? With a sense of nihilism, cynicism? Who can we turn to? Is there anybody on the horizon that seems truly out there with integrity and a vision, and that you can trust in that way, that they do really represent the interests of the people in this city in particular? Yeah.
Well, look, I had high hopes for AOC.
Right.
We met on the campaign trail, when she was just a fly by night, who's got no hope whatsoever against Joe Crowley, who was one of the most powerful congressmen, right? No one took her seriously, and she won, and she rocked the system. And look, the jury's still out. We've seen how she has modulated her language, particularly in regards to Israel, and kind of backed away from a more kind of critical stance on Israel. And there are obvious political reasons for that. That to me is pretty disappointing. But we're going to see. But it's going to be very hard, if she's got ambitions for higher office, and they all do, right, to make that transition to the U.S. Senate without having to really compromise the principles that she ran on. And as I said, story's still out, but she has compromised so far.
Okay, we'll get into that. It's interesting as you're speaking. We've had Mark Rudd on this show, for example, and we've had. Wish we could have had Abby Hoffman, but we did have his biographer on. We recently had Curtis Lewa on talk about performance and politics and so on, and a number of other progressive politicians and so on. So I guess what I'm trying to drive at here is Rudd, of course, was in the mainstream, or I shouldn't say mainstream. He was in the one of the major leaders of the student movement, and took it, SDS and Weatherman, a particular route that he now very, very much regrets. But going beyond that, what he explained very much, and we've had Todd Gitlin on also. You probably know him from the journalism school, and Todd's been on the show a few times. And what we've understood through these individuals is that there was a great cynicism about power, about seeking power. And I noticed that you talked about participatory journalism as well. So the issue of power and fitting in and all the goodies that come from that, is that something that could possibly be avoided, or can people raise themselves, activists raise themselves beyond this? People like Cornel West, we've had on a number of times. Again, Reverend Barber, who's a couple of individuals. And some of the people, of course, I mentioned, Chomsky's been on too. I mean, these people go beyond the struggle for power. They're not about that. Their vision, their substance transcends the message, if you will. Well, that was sort of a long-winded question.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. but sort of what I kind of imagined was that I could bring those great professors, Cornel West, for example, right, in that model, right, of kind of echoing the truth teller, entering into politics, becoming the politician. And I think it's impossible. I don't think you can be a truth teller and be a successful politician. By successful, I mean win, right? Win that 51%, raise the money necessary to get yourself elected. It's no one wants to hear from a prophet. Unless people, generally speaking, see the crisis right in front of them, it's very hard for them to see the crisis coming down the road. And oftentimes they don't want to hear it. Now you can pull 30% of the vote, which is something I did.
Yeah.
Right. Telling the future, warning of the crisis, calling out the hypocrisy and the mendacity around you. But winning a majority is very difficult doing that. So I think that, like, if you want to change the system, I think being on the outside is probably the best way. I think that conclusion is one of the things that I learned being a politician.
Well, so David, let me be a little bit provocative here, as I think we also talked before. My mentor at Columbia was Richard Cloward, Cloward and Piven, who led the welfare rights movement. And their perspective was pretty much like yours, in the sense that that the system, working within the system, at least most of the time, isn't going to bring the sort of results you want to achieve. They were particularly focused on, Cloward and Piven, on poor people's rights. So their argument was to create, or to go with the chaos and disruption. They called it the census politics, and exacerbate that, because the poor only get what they get during these brief periods of disruption. So it's not about getting people elected, although you can also work within the system. And as I think you're also talking about, pushing the system to take more progressive stance. But the real key action, the moment that you have, the very brief moments you have, involve not searching for some messiah or a leader, but to exacerbate the frustrations, if you will, or the census feelings that people are feeling, the poor, the working class, and the middle class, because that's when they get whatever they're going to get it there.
That's right. And it's sort of like you're riding the wave, right? It's surfing. It's seeing the wave coming, making sure you're in the proper position to ride that wave when it does come. You're ready for it. And we all feel this wave coming. We all feel that there is some sort of impending crash. It's going to be economic, which is also going to be social. I think that is where the opportunity will come for decisive change, for real change, for truly progressive change. And it's that understanding that it's not going to come from a charismatic leader, but it's going to come from the bottom up, and not just poor people this time. The middle class, which is being destroyed as we speak, need to join hands with the poor people and the working class to save our cities, save our country, save our economy. But that is only going to happen when the big crash comes.
Again, for your time, but to a certain extent, the last mayor that I can remember that had the sort of vision, the integrity, and literally walked the streets on behalf of people was John Lindsay, who got crucified by unions and all kinds of people. But he was the one that I certainly remember. When was he? Mid-70s, I think he was our mayor. So we've had basically functionaries since then. But Lindsay was a charismatic leader who you knew and felt, and the people out there in the streets understood and felt at a deep level that he was for them.
Yes.
And yet, as you say, the power forces responded and did him in.
The New York City mayor used to be a very powerful office, but after the 1970s financial crisis, the banks took over New York City, and party bosses and mayors have become basically functionaries of the money, and there's very little leeway. Now, there are kind of areas where, like Rudy Giuliani with crime, where that's where they can get aggressive. But in terms of the actual sort of social justice and a kind of Lindsay-esque vision coming out of City Hall, you're not going to see that again, or not for a very long time.
Well, let's dive into. I was watching your interview on MNN a few years ago. Jeff Beck, I think was his name, Matt Beck, perhaps, and you talked about Rebney. Help us understand that, because you ran as a leader against the real estate board. That's what Rebney is, the real estate board of New York. And help our audience understand why that job survival bill has never been able to even really have a chance in the city council and assembly, with the Assembly of New York for 30 years. So we've also had Steve Null on, by the way, on this show. And again, he's described some of the inner workings and political shenanigans at that level, and nothing seems to ever really bring about the sort of bill that so many millions of people need in this city. And by the way, as Steve said, if politicians would really, really take it on, they would win. And we've had, I'm not going to name names, but we've had other progressive politicians on board who didn't quite know their position on this.
Yeah.
Help us understand this.
Well, one of the talents of politicians is making it seem as though they're really confused about what you're asking them when they're not. They know exactly what you're asking them. So don't trust politicians when they act confused over a bill that was submitted by Ruth Messenger in 1986. It had sponsors, almost 30 sponsors in the city council. And remember, there are 51 members, so that's enough to pass if the speaker this time around, although there's a long line of speakers that have just held up this bill, Corey Johnson would just submit it to a vote. That's all we're asking. Just bring it up for a vote. We're not even asking you to vote for it.
Right, David? Corey Johnson didn't. I just want to make it clear. He never even brought it up to a vote. This is the
no one has. See, this is the remarkable thing.
This is ridiculous. And again, this is about commercial real estate. It gets to the center of your complaint about the real estate industry taking over development and causing rents to go up and for the middle class and working class.
And artificially manipulating the market.
Yes.
So that you have these absurd things where a storefront will remain empty for years because the landlord makes more money not renting the space than renting it. Right?
Absolutely. I'm on 98th in Riverside, so a couple of. There have been, a Chinese restaurant on 98th has been vacant for 5-6 years.
That's right.
Several other, all up and down Broadway. It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous, right? And it's destroying New York City. And all this bill will do is, A, it'll guarantee a rent renewal offer, and B, if the landlord and tenant can't come to an agreement, they go to an arbitrator who finds the reasonable market-based rent. The rent's still going to go up. Sometimes it's going to go up astronomically, but you're not going to have a 300 and 400% increase, is what you're seeing today. You're not going to have all these empty storefronts. And you're not going to have the extortion payments that often happen, cash under the table, that small business owners, particularly immigrant small business owners, have to pay landlords just to get a new lease.
Right.
It just provides rationality to the system. But the Real Estate Board of New York, or REBNY, the most powerful lobbying organization in New York State and New York City, is dead set against this. They have been since the 1980s, and they take it as a mark of pride that they've been able to kill this bill through every administration since.
So-called progressive, Democrats, which control the council, city council, they don't stand up. They're in the pockets of they are eventually, become tools of the industry. I mean, is it that simple, or is it they just bought off or pay?
I asked Mark Levine, who's now the borough president. I said, Mark, look, we got a majority of co-sponsors on the city council on this Small Business Job Survival Act. All right, why is no one, making a move to, do a motion to discharge, right? Get the bill, force the city council speaker to do it. And he's like, well, no one wants to stick their neck out. And I was like, but wait, don't they want this bill? And he said, well, not necessarily. Sometimes city council members will sponsor a bill knowing full well that there's no chance in hell that bill is actually going to get to the floor, that they're actually going to have to vote for a bill that the people who write the checks, the campaign contributors, the Real Estate Board of New York, would punish them. So there is a kabuki-esque kind of quality to the small business bill, which I never would have understood unless I actually got behind the scenes to fight for it.
To see what was going on there. And again, this bill, the Job Survival Act bill, would establish what sort of rights for small businesses?
The most important thing is the guaranteed lease renewal offer. Oftentimes landlords will just not renew the lease for a successful small business, because what they do is they get the tenant out, then bring in a reappraisal of the reappraiser of the building, get a massive mega loan from that, use that to buy another building. They could play it on the stock market. All they have to do is, at least on paper, show that they are getting a certain level of rent. They don't actually have to get the real rent, or the rent that they say they're going to get on their loan application. In the meantime, they can write off lost revenue from the rent that they're not getting from their empty storefront, from their business-related taxes. So it's basically the kind of money schemes that happen at the end of a big real estate bubble, which is what we're in, and eventually it's New York that's going to be left holding the bag.
Yeah.
And it's not a radical solution. This is a common sense solution. The rent's still going to go up. The landlord's still going to make a killing, but the small businesses will stay in place. That's the idea of the Small Business Job Survival Act.
And that gets us into the survival not only of the city, middle and working class and poor. Our democracy really is dependent upon a fuller participation, an acknowledgement of those needs and interests. But try as we might, it just doesn't seem to happen. Now, you mentioned before about that there has to be such a fundamental basic crisis before possible action. But I mean, with all due respect, how much more of a crisis can we be in with the virus, where, Chomsky points out we're 60 seconds from midnight by the Bureau of Atomic Scientists. We're in the middle of a pandemic that is going to reach well over 1 million people, if it hasn't already. So again, what more of a crisis do you need for there to be that sort of action?
Yeah. Well, we're going to find out.
We're going to find out.
This thing is not over. And I get very worried, every day that goes by, a new variant can emerge. It looks like Omicron might not be as bad as they feared, but there's going to be another one after that, right? We're not vaccinating the world. We're only vaccinating a select population. And so these viruses are going to vary as the years go by, right? So that very much scares me. But I think it's also part of a bigger story, right? That this economy has very much favored the rich over the middle class, over the poor, over the working Americans, and it's unsustainable, and it will crash. And so we have also a political crisis in which a majority of Americans really don't trust, either party. And you have one party rallying around this charismatic knucklehead who seems to be able to do and say no wrong. And then another party, where we just have Joe Biden, who doesn't seem to stand up for anything, except he's not Donald Trump. And anybody who looks at what's going on, how 2024 is shaping up, sort of knows this is not a healthy democracy.
Right.
And so this political crisis, this biological crisis, and economic crisis, all coming together at the same time. I think it's something that has only just begun.
And a moral one as well. Are you planning on running for anything?
No, I think I'm done with politics, at least for now.
Really?
Yeah. I feel as though that the ability to make change that way is null. That I would rather focus on my teaching. I've really kind of put my energy into that, because it's through the new generation, the survivors, that we're actually going to see a redemption, that we're all going to see the green shoots that are going to bring us into a new era. And so that's been my main focus, something I haven't necessarily put 100% of my focus on in previous eras when I was focused on books and television and politics. Now I'm whole hog about my students.
I was just going to ask you, do you see that among your students? You see the sort of idealism and the integrity? Or is this going to be just a phase until they graduate and then get out there?
No, they have been scarred and burned, and they are very suspicious of everyone.
Yeah.
As well they should be, because they have been lied to. The difference is they very much realize it, and they now have a much more critical eye on both parties, on the system, and a kind of resentment that, hey, we're left holding the bag here. Not you people, not you baby boomers, not you millionaires and billionaires with your bunkers, right? We're the ones that are being left holding the bag. And so there's a thirst for knowledge about, okay, how did we get here? What is the history behind this mess? And then out of that, after there is this crash, what are the tools we're going to need in order to rebuild? And that is something that I've just seen in the last few years with my students, and it's something that gives me some hope.
Yeah, me too, actually. We've also, I'm working with psychiatrist James Gilligan and Bandy Lee, who edited the 2-volume text, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. Our proposal to set up an Institute for the Prevention of Violence was accepted at Union Theological. And it was something we could maybe talk about at some other point, because this is something that I think is very, very doable. It provides a sort of the history, the paradigm that's needed, and for young people in particular to go out there and make the changes that are going to stick. Because we're again talking about structures and institutions. What about the media? You've written extensively about it. Do you have any hopes for that? The mass media?
Well, what I have hopes for is technology like this discussion, right? For YouTube, for the diversity of voices out there. And yes, there's going to be misinformation and fake news and conspiracy theory. But I mean, that's the whole premise of the First Amendment, is that you allow this kind of flood of different ideas and perspectives and information. And then out of that will emerge the truth. The days of the gatekeepers of the New York Times, of CBS News, of Walter Cronkite, right? Of just telling us all the day's news, and we have this one trusted man. Those days are over. And It had good aspects and bad aspects at the time, but it's definitely not of today. So out of this chaos, I think will emerge a better truth and a new kind of perspective, which I even see in my students.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that. That's the hope I have too. We talked a little about Senator Gravel's and the national initiative that he introduced, the ability of a citizen to make laws. And one of my colleagues here and frequent visitor on the show, he's actually going to be on next week, is Manny Gomez. I don't know if you know
I know Manny. Of course I know Manny.
Oh, man, great. Well, he's, of course, Crime Plus Punishment. And we started a podcast. He's so busy. It's so hard to get him to sit down weekly. But I'm glad you know him. And he has been involved in developing a Department of Civilian Justice bill that he's trying to introduce. He's also gone ahead with the other bills, the Accountability Act, and the federal proposals as well. So, and which he, as he proudly says, wrote up in the New York Public Library and stayed there the whole day until they threw him out. So this is a sort of, what do you think of?
Absolutely. This is the hope, right? It's these initiatives, these referendums where the people stand up and say, this is what we want, right? Because it's not that kind of leadership is not going to come from the Democrats or the Republicans in Congress, let's say, right? Who just approved this almost $800 billion defense bill.
Right.
If the American public actually could choose between stimulus checks and an $800 billion defense bill, what would they choose? That when you actually look at the polling of how the majority of Americans feel about universal health care coverage, about the defense bills and foreign policy, you'd find that they're actually way more to the left than your typical Democrat in the U.S. Congress. So if we can get more action coming from the grassroots through referendums like Manny's bill, through what Senator Gravel had in mind with the national referendum,
right.
I think that we could really make substantial change, and it would almost kind of shame the politicians into doing the right thing every once in a while.
But as you probably know, Manny's having a hell of a time. This is a bill that Serpico, he and Serpico are behind. Norm Siegel, the ACLU is about a lot of really great people. He's having a hell of a time getting sponsorship for it and getting someone out there, politician, that will introduce it. He's doing this.
Look, you have to remember the politicians are all about the power.
Yeah.
They don't want to surrender that kind of power.
Yeah.
Right? If there's going to be a bill, it's going to go through them. Right. That would set a really kind of potentially dangerous precedent for any politician who's interested in power and is being told by the party bosses, you better not support this because that's a threat to our power. And, unfortunately, New York City is a one-party town. We don't really have a real opposition party. So, this is the kind of the typical level of corruption that's going to emerge. So I very much believe in these initiatives and referendums. I think that is the hope to resist the system. And I hope that people will get behind it, force the politician's hand like Manny.
Yeah. Do we need another Abby Hoffman for this generation?
We always have Abby Hoffman. Are you kidding me?
Yeah. In terms of and using the media for progressive purposes.
Yeah, I think that there are kind of Abby Hoffmans around. Certainly no one with that level of national profile, and it's much harder in this fractured media world to acquire that level of national prominence, even as a kind of prankster, jokester, commentator like Abby Hoffman.
Yeah, we did.
So I think that the avenues that you're going to see that kind of thing are through a YouTube, where it's very common. Like you see, Jimmy Dore, and you see I'm drawing a blank on the Englishman's name. These comedians who have these political profiles, who are speaking a language of dissent and critique in a funny way. And I think that it is very, very helpful.
Well, last week we did a show with Randy Credico, who has a serious podcast on Julian Assange that he is involved in as well. You brought up AOC in Israel. We only have a few minutes to go. It's one of the prime interests of this show as the Radical Imagination, Spiritual Progressives. We bring the Middle East situation on as many times as we can. But let me get your take. Are you for a two-state solution?
I am. And look, I'm not anti-Israel per se, right? I'm just anti a lot of the human rights violations that the Israeli government is engaged in. And I think that you can have a healthy critique, but you have to be willing to critique. You have to be willing to get a lot of opposition and attacks from people who aren't, sort of seeing and appreciating the other side perspective. And I think that's very hard for a politician to do, especially a politician in New York City who wants to survive potentially a redistricting. So I understand her political move here and why she needed to kind of move away from the more critical language regarding Israel that we saw her use in her first run to a now more moderate approach. I get the political move, but it's very disappointing because that was the hope, is that to have a politician from New York City taking the brave stand of saying, I am a friend of Israel, but I am also a friend who's going to critique Israel, right? That is something that we need desperately right now.
And we only have a couple more minutes, but again, as you know, words are so important. Zionism, though, that seems to be the real bugaboo that the left gets involved in and can never agree or disagree, and emotions run high. So does Israel have a right to exist? Is it possible to do that without having a Zionist perspective?
The problem with that is, well, once you take that position that Israel doesn't have the right to exist, Israel's not going to listen to you. Israel is not going to listen to you when you say,
Would any other country?
What's that? No country would, right? Once you call into question the very basis of its existence, you're lost to them, right? And then that shuts down any ability to get them to change policies that on a daily basis are affecting the lives of the Palestinian people. And that is something which, in the interests of Israel should do. And that those of us who have an emotional attachment to Israel want it to be the best Israel, a moral Israel, not one that in many ways is kind of repeating the mistakes of the past and adopting some of the attitudes that
within that democratic tradition. I wish we could go on and on. This hours just flew by. David, we've got to let it go here. Unfortunately, so many other points and questions I'd love to discuss with you. Let's do this again, okay?
Let's do it again, Jim. Anytime. You let me know.
All right, man. Thank you so very much, David, and all the best. And thank you again for being on the show. Thank you all for watching us this week on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Freddos, your host on The Radical Imagination. We'll see you again next week.
The statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
When is the last time you heard CNN say the Pentagon is lying?
We don't have state media in the United States, but if we had it, how would it be any different?
I think the media is really nihilistic. It's about making money. What makes money in this country happens to be avoiding difficult truths about our society.
Thousands and thousands of people were cheering as that building was coming down.
You have to get rid of this ignorant and meddlesome majority, control them, make sure they do the right things, all for their own good, incidentally.
Congresswoman, let me interrupt you just for a moment. We've got some breaking news out of Miami. Justin Bieber has been arrested on a number of charges.
Good journalism today has the state in its crosshairs, and you never want to punch down. You always want to punch up.
I would say our mission statement is to produce adversarial, fearless journalism. The more power someone wields, the more journalistic accountability and scrutiny they need.
There are policies that have been enacted, there are bombs that have been dropped, as a consequence of which these millions of people are destitute in the way that they are. And we have to allow them to tell that story.
There's only two types of reporters. There's those who care and those who don't. Most of them don't care.
I'm amused at people who claim that the governments don't lie. Really? You know human beings that never lie? Of course they lie!
I tried to prove what I was saying from the horse's mouth, as it were, using the government's own documents.
I can draw a line from Eye of Stone directly to what I'm doing now.
I thought, how could the President of the United States be involved in something this dumb at the beginning?
We're being dumbed down, we're being watered down, and we're being told information which is false.
Make these people own this shit.
When the media acts as a conveyor belt for the lies, why it matters is because lies take lives.
I find in our own government documents nothing but lies.